It's good to be here because we stand at a crossroads in our relationship with our neighbors. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about the options that lay before us. But before I do, I'd like to talk about the context in which we consider those options. All things across the Americas do not break in the same way. If this cup breaks in Santiago, Chile, the way that we describe it breaking is la taza se rompió. The cup broke itself. And I asked my wife, who happens to come from Venezuela, about this issue. And I said, you're not assigning blame for the breaking of the cup. She said, no, it's the same. The cup is broken. Yes, but I spent some time working in Venezuela, and it astonished me the degree to which someone could say, sickness happened to me. In the US, we say, I got sick. If you want to say, I forgot something, it was forgotten to me. And if you want to understand these markets, you have to start by understanding the mindset that they approach both opportunities as well as the challenges. And so, for instance, in Spanish, there's no word for compromise. You say compromiso, which roughly translates more to I have an obligation. So when you're looking at the Latin American market, you need to take into consideration what we call multifaceted market mapping. You need to not only look at it through a US frame, but to apply some of the local preferences, considerations, linguistic differences to understanding why is there, for instance, an opportunity in, or a perceived opportunity in this sector. Is it because perhaps in that country there is not a need for, not an interest in those products? Digging deeper. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the tactics that you can use to do that. But I also want to start out this presentation and being given the task to cover the expansive markets that the Americas represent is pretty intimidating. And so what I've chosen to do is to talk about three positive trends and three negative trends. And then we'll wrap up looking at some of these tactics and how you might approach your engagement with those markets. So first, the Americas, for the first time in our lifetime, is at peace. The Colombian government has signed a peace agreement with the FARC, which a lot of observers are putting great stock in. And this has consequences not only for Colombia, not only for its neighbors, but for the Americas as a whole. It's writing a new chapter about what the Americas can be. No longer is it the place where there is civil war and the drug trade, perhaps, that helped to fuel it. We can write a new chapter. There is no armed group that has the international recognition. And recognition, I don't mean in the state sense, but recognition as in the name and the brand value that the FARC did. And this presents an opportunity. And so looking at the trend of peace, looking at the trend of where both Colombia and the Americas can go over the next few years, makes one hopeful. The Americas, despite some recent road bumps, is more prosperous than at any time in history. It is a market that for the first time in our lifetime has a significant market for goods from the Americas and from the United States. And yet, this middle class, this massive middle class, we still have yet to engage in a meaningful way. There remains undoubtedly inequity in many countries across the Americas, but one of the positive contributions of governments, even governments with which we've had some disagreements, is that poverty has steadily declined over recent years. And what we're seeing is a new middle class that wants American goods, that is exposed to America in a way they've never been before, on the internet, on television, on social media. And so how are we responding to this? And in a lot of ways, what that represents is the emergence of an American identity. It is an identity that spans from Miami all the way through to Montevideo. It is an identity that is starting to congeal. And that is an identity that, while many here in the United States may not recognize it, certainly in many parts of Latin America, there is a recognition that we are becoming more of a unified hemisphere. We're also progressing. We're progressing in examples that we've seen tackling corruption. The president of Guatemala, the president of Brazil, have been democratically removed from office and have faced the justice of their people and of their elected representatives. That is astonishing. That is an astonishing development in our hemisphere, which for too long was marked by leaders who were corrupt, by leaders who had a small cadre of friends and family that benefited from the largesse of the state. And we're seeing a trend towards more moderate politics. No longer are politics in many of these countries taking place at the extremes. You see more of a convergence into the middle, into governments that recognize that on the one hand, they do have to address some of the inequities that exist in their countries, while on the other hand, they have to make smart, market-minded decisions. We're seeing initiatives that are making important investments in the future of their countries and of their economies. When I was at the White House, we spent a lot of time working on promoting educational exchanges across the Americas. The President has a 100,000 Strong in the Americas initiative, where we're trying to get 100,000 of our students to study in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 100,000 students from Latin America and the Caribbean to come here by 2020. We're on track, at least on the foreign students coming. We're still working to get more students from the US to go. But at the same time, Mexico and Brazil have their own 100,000 strong program. They're paying for it. They are paying, as I'm sure many of the faculty and those who work on foreign students' recruitment know. They are making a major investment in the future of their country. And these are positive changes. We saw just yesterday that Brazil has come out and said, we are going to work on privatizing our infrastructure and some of our state-owned companies. And those are encouraging trends. But they face challenges as well. And one of the most significant challenges are economies that are not diversified enough. There is too much dependence in too many countries on natural resources. And for too long, Latin America enjoyed a Chinese economy that would consume with a ferocious appetite all of its natural resources. And when that started to abate, there has been no replacement for it. And we have not yet seen a significant effort in many of these countries to diversify their economies. But this creates an opportunity as well. American companies can enter this void. There are huge swaths of the market that are unoccupied. And yet we have not yet seen American firms moving in to take over in many of those areas. I saw an astonishing statistic yesterday that there are more patents, or were more patents in 2015, issued to Israel than to all of Latin America. There is an innovation problem in Latin America. There is an entrepreneurship problem in Latin America. We're going to talk about Chile in just a minute and what they've done to address it. But this also presents an opportunity for American firms. They need American innovation. They need our entrepreneurial spirit. And if you can package your presence and your engagement in the country in those terms, you will not only find yourself welcome, you will find red carpets rolling out and opportunities to engage both in the business sector and beyond. There's a challenge with populism. And while in many countries we've seen populist extreme movements give way to more moderate politics, it's still there. It's still there in countries like Venezuela, which I know particularly well. It's still there in Ecuador. But it's also still there in Brazil and still present in countries like Peru and elsewhere. And it's an issue that these governments need to engage. And as they move forward, for instance, in Brazil, with some of the reforms that are necessary, are they going to take account of some of the concerns, some of the challenges that they will, and criticisms they will receive from the left? This is an open question and one that I think still has to be addressed. We also have seen examples, and here I'm citing the case of Podemos in Spain, where a leftist movement can throw a significant wrench into the political process, even if they are not in the majority. And I think that is a very real concern for many of the countries across the Americas, that even though these movements may have lost the popular support, they retain a significant base, and they are able to move to block many measures. There's also, quite frankly, a US policy problem. There is, obviously, in our presidential campaign, on both sides of the aisle, concerns about how we are talking about trade. There are concerns about how we are talking about immigration. And there are concerns about the impact that it will continue to have long after all of the lawn signs and the TV commercials have gone away. And we need to be cognizant of that. We need to be cognizant as we go into the next administration, whether it is a Trump or a Clinton administration, that saying we're not supportive of TPP will have ramifications across countries like Mexico and Chile and Colombia that made significant compromises. The comments on NAFTA, the comments on some of the free trade agreements will have consequences, and we need to restore that credibility. I would also say, shifting to a couple cases quickly, that Chile is one of the markets that I would explore if I were saying, where in Latin America do I want to start? Now, Chile's economy certainly has plateaued in recent years, but when you look at the fundamentals, Chile's institutions, Chile's government and their engagement present some very attractive opportunities. And as you start to think about the Americas, one of the things you have to take into consideration is that it isn't just an individual market. Chile is part of the Pacific Alliance. And now all of a sudden you have markets of hundreds of millions of people that stretch from Mexico all the way down to Patagonia. And so Chile is a place that ought to be on your radar if it isn't already. They, as I mentioned earlier, have made a major investment in trying to address their entrepreneurship deficit in something called Startup Chile, bringing down foreign entrepreneurs, saying, you don't even have to start your business here. We just want you to spend time here, to share your entrepreneurial spirit. We will support and invest there. And that's the kind of policy that is encouraging for a foreign company looking at investment. Another case, just briefly, is that of Mexico. You know, we've long looked at Mexico as the home of the maquiladoras. It is not only America's production facility. It is a massive market, 150 million, roughly. It is a place that is, again, quickly developing, that goes beyond our stereotypes of immigration issues and drug issues. I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and it is remarkable the degree to which, when you talk to businessmen and businesswomen in Mexico City, they will tell you the Americans are absent. We are right next door to Mexico, and yet when opportunities open up, American companies don't show up. And when they do show up, and this is the comment of one of the leading business people in Mexico, he said, "You're too slow. You're talking about solar power, well, the Europeans are running circles around you." So we need to look southward, we need to look at our neighbor, and we need to look beyond some of our preconceptions and even some of the news stories that come out on our television. I would also say Mexico is going to be, irrespective of what happens with TPP, an incredibly important country, equally so with Chile. In the case of Mexico, we have one of the oldest free trade agreements that exists in our country with Mexico. That means Mexico is going to offer a prime market for whatever comes next. And I know Christina is going to come and talk a little bit about the TPP and our free trade efforts with the administration. And with the case of Chile, they have free trade agreements with almost all of the TPP partners. So if you're trying to hedge your bets, irrespective of what happens over the course of the next couple of years, those are two places that I would certainly keep in mind. I'm going to just briefly go over, because I do want to leave some time for questions, some of the tactics that I think are important when you're looking at Latin America. First, as I mentioned at the outset, multifaceted market mapping. You need to employ a little bit of those tools, the tradecraft of diplomacy when you're looking at these issues. Simply looking at the statistics, looking at the same sources of information as all of your competitors is not going to provide you with an accurate picture. It's not going to provide you with a comparative advantage. So look at comparative approaches. Don't just analyze, here's what I'm seeing in Brazil or here's what I'm seeing in Uruguay. Look beyond. Look across borders. Look at the sources. Oftentimes in America, we have a tendency to rely on figures, statistics as facts. There are a lot of cases in Latin America, even in some of the better economies, where those statistics, as we saw in the case of Brazil, don't necessarily paint the whole story. You need to move beyond. Part of multifaceted market mapping is getting different sources. It's going out and finding people who can provide you with information that is not this groupthink. Don't just talk to the business leaders. Talk to civil society. Talk to some of the community leaders. They could have told you several years ago that there were issues in Brazil. They could have told you that there were opportunities in Colombia. I'd also say, look at actions. Oftentimes we focus on people's words. Well, if you've spent any time in Mexico, you certainly will know that you can walk into a meeting, people will tell you one thing, and yet in the weeks and months that follow, it may not come to pass. So focus in on what people do. What have they done in the past? What is it that they are currently doing, and what does that portend for where they're likely to go? Look at their bias. Look at their perspective. Don't just take what people are saying at face value. It's very important that as you're analyzing someone's information, you're analyzing the data, you're trying to understand what it means. I'm very fond of saying that you can Google anything other than what it means. And this is so true in Latin America. You can find stories, and there are going to be stories on media outlets like Telesur, sponsored by Venezuela, that will paint one picture. And if you, because they kindly translate it for you in English, if you read that, you're going to have a very different view of reality than if you went and found other news sources, you went and found information from other individuals. I'd also just briefly say on the marketing side, relationships are so important in Latin America. It is critical that you invest in those relationships. Part of investing in that relationship is building it from the stage of that market research. Go out and engage, as we would in the diplomatic community, those influential individuals and institutions. Get their perspectives, and then sustain it. Don't just use it as, I can imagine if someone from Austria came over here and said, hi, I want all the information on Ohio. Are you going to give them the best information? Build, nurture those relationships, and those will become your advocates, those will become your amplifiers and your ambassadors. I would also say that part of that partnership is understanding that you don't necessarily have to invest in advertising and marketing campaigns that are very expensive. You can use those relationships to establish your credibility, your resonance, your recognition in the market. Empower those stories. Provide those relationships platforms for sharing it. And then think of it as a spectrum of engagement that goes from exposing them to your product and your company, to engaging them, to enlisting them in your efforts. Finally, on risk management, risk has gone regular, and particularly in the Americas, we've seen many cases in recent years of companies making the wrong bet. You need to go in eyes wide open. You need to get prepared so that whether it's something that deals with your reputation, and as an American company, we will undoubtedly face challenges in the coming years of what politicians say or do, be prepared. Get not only prepared with a reaction, you need to build, we call it the counter-crisis management strategies. You need to build the tools. If somebody in the White House or in Congress said something outlandish, do you have something ready that is a template, that is a tool that you can use to respond? Next, look at cases where, for instance, there's the example recently we've seen of the Panama Papers. Identify your vulnerabilities. There are two ways you could have looked at the Panama Papers. On the one hand, you could have said, yeah, some people who are well-to-do are looking for opportunities, as they do in many parts of the world, as a potential source for managing that. The other way you could look at it is what transpired. And I was talking to a reporter from the Financial Times about this, and what was interesting about it was the perspective that he had was they weren't ready. They knew they had this vulnerability, and yet they had not done anything to actually prepare for the eventuality that it could get exposed. Prepare for that eventuality. Don't just prepare plans, don't just prepare procedures, prepare what you're going to need to respond. Let me wrap up, because I know we're running over time, with just saying briefly, why here, why now? The Americas has long been forgotten here in the United States as a market for our goods and our services. And yet, at this moment where we are considering TPP, where we are looking at how do we diversify our supply chains, how do we diversify our markets, there is no place in the world that is more attractive than the Americas. There is no place in the world, as we face challenges in Europe, Asia starts to slow and to find its new footing, than the Americas for a relatively sure bet. The Americas is the place where we need to establish a strong footing so that we can have the kind of stability, we can have the kind of structures that are going to enable us to take advantage of opportunities in Asia, in Europe, in other parts of the world. I look forward to continuing to have this discussion. We'll be around today. I know we've got time throughout the program for a panel and for some other conversations. So thank you for having me, and look forward to continuing this discussion.